Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My guest today is an aviation and space psychologist with more than 25 years of experience. She is also a former director of the Centre for Space Medicine at UCL. She's worked with astronauts, pilots, and surgeons to understand how humans perform in extreme environments, and she brings a fascinating perspective on both outer space and inner space. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ia Whiteley. Ia, welcome.
Thank you, Auntie. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
It's good to have you on. And I've had several guests. I never said this to you previously. I've had several guests in the past bring your name up in various different conversations, including Diana Pasulka, Dr. Gary Nolan. So it's really good to have you on and get to speak to you. There's a whole load of different ways we could go in this conversation, a lot of different tangents, but I'm going to try and keep it as grounded as possible, if that's indeed possible given what we're talking about. But first off, Ia, I want to know a little bit about you and your background, and how does someone get to become a space psychologist?
My passion was to find out what our abilities are as a human being. And I was interested where our limits, what's our potential, can we develop it? Have we have an effect on it? Can we train it? And that led me to explore this as a child, as a teenager. And then I wanted to see if I could study our extrasensory perception. So through martial art, I was exposed or lucky where I found out that I could sense things that other people couldn't. And they were not outside, I would say, scientific realm. It's just ability to observe and being aware, and you would rely more on your feelings of the wind, as the people are moving about. You're listening, you become more audio spatially acute as well. And but then there were things of in when we were practicing doing kata and also sparring, it was you could see that what the person will do. And the more I studied psychology later on, the more I could explain, oh, I could have read micro expressions, I could, read their body language. But then when I come to actual training, it's just not that. It's something more to that. And that's what drove me to explore more. And of course, people who do extraordinary jobs in extraordinary environments, astronauts. So first I worked with pilots and military pilots as well in Australia. And then slowly I just chose what I could do closer to being working with astronauts. And European Space Agency grants came up and I bid for them as part of UK, initially commercial company, and then University College London. Yes.
And you're based in the UK now, like myself, but you're from Latvia, is that correct?
Yes, yes. My hometown is Riga, Latvia.
I know Latvia well from being a football fan and watching many Scotland games, playing Latvia in the past. What growing up in Latvia, did you have an interest in the UFO topic, the paranormal, anything? You talked about ESP, perhaps from an early age having an interest. What was your kind of grounding in growing up?
Latvia actually is an epicenter for UFO experts, not necessarily the activity, but I grew up with the knowing that it exists. So as a teenager, you choose different clubs, activities, but also we had a lot of magazines or journals that we could subscribe. And they were specialized specifically on UFO as well. My interest was more in extrasensory perception, so I was diverted more to that. Although we had people who would come to sightings, who would come to exchange their experiences, and it was sort of in the background, so it wasn't something I didn't grow up with that it didn't exist. I just knew some people were interested in that. Some people were interested in I don't know, botanics, and some people were interested in martial art, and someone in UFO. Um,
Is there a reason for there being, you mentioned there's a lot of experts in the field in Latvia, but it's not necessarily a hotbed or a popular place for sightings. Why is that?
Perhaps people who were most curious were living in Latvia at the time because it was part of Soviet Union, and but Latvia does have anomalies or phenomena of various types as well. So I think it often, as it often is, people get attracted to a hub, and whoever creates a hub, then that what happens. As I say, I didn't attend any of those events, but I grew up knowing that that exists. It wasn't for me like a change in my belief system, or I just wasn't following that or attracted to that.
No, that's fair. So, talk about your work then with astronauts and pilots, because this is fascinating. And as a layman to aviation or space psychology, explain it to me like I'm stupid. And what exactly is it you do, and how do you start to really get involved in the field deeper and deeper?
Yes, of course. I began with understanding how to present information to the pilot in the way that they could process it fastly and make effective decision makings, and also making no errors or eliminate as many as possible. We're human, so we do misinformation or misinterpret, and also make our own judgment. And at the time, right in year 2000 or just before and just after, automated aircraft came in. Like there was a massive change in the way the aircrafts were constructed or built. And suddenly there were glass cockpits. So the fleets were replaced very rapidly because the Airbus and Boeing, two leading companies, they, of course, Lockheed Martin was doing military aircraft. They both had different cockpit philosophy. And what that means is that Airbus had removed the stick. So, so you have a yoke when you're flying, and they removed that altogether. So, and they put like a game stick, just a one, like a joystick. Just that's what they've done. And there was a lot of debate about what is good and not good for the pilot, how difficult or not difficult. And as we all grow up with our own wants and needs or what habits that we don't want to change, there was a host of pilots that did not want to accept Airbus, and there were those pilots who, would embrace, especially a new generation, would be very interested in flying Airbus. And because of that rapid change, they had to train a lot of people to fly this completely novel display that no longer had clock dials, because it used to be just mostly clocks, and also primary flight display, which was also round at the time. Or sometimes it would be square, but inside the display would be round. And the problem is that what the person was used to look for information or understand the logic of how the aircraft would fly suddenly changed, because it was designed by engineers from ground up like a novel system. And there was no incremental entry like we had with our phones, for example. Like I grew up with no mobile phone, and then there was Ericsson, Nokia, and then suddenly there were many others. And you kind of learned slowly of how to operate different models and what Android and Apple and different systems. But here there was a sudden jump, and because of that there was a mismatch of what was expectation of what I'm doing and what the aircraft would do, because it is a partnership. So my degree or part of my work was actually called human computer interaction, or and the problem at the time was that the pilots misunderstood what automation mode or what automation functions the aircraft was performing. And that was presented on the displays. And some of that, the presentation was not intuitive. And intuitive is a tricky word, but basically the pilots were not seeing it. And hence we had aircraft crash nearly every week, commercial flight, which is horrific because of that. And some of them were tragic and some of them were incidents. And there were many more incidents, and pilots were afraid to talk about this because they thought that because they excel at their job beforehand, they passed with flying colors all of their training, and suddenly they have problems. They felt and named the problem ghost in the cockpit because they couldn't understand who was changing the aircraft from what they've put it in. But what was happening, the light would go off as the way of informing the pilot instead of changing the color, for example. So the button will go off automatically when the mode would change to another way the aircraft would fly. So managing the aircraft was becoming difficult and unclear. And so that's when I came in, and that was my expertise. I was interviewing pilots. I was on all of the forums that pilots were reporting this because they were afraid to speak up. Because if they speak up, it meant that they're not good at their job. And also pilots were punished, meaning they lost their job, they lost their flight hours, they would go into retraining, but people did not know how to retrain. They didn't understand. Even pilots who were captain, they're called, just trying to think what was the name, but it's the captain who would train the rest of the fleet, for example, of the pilots. Oh, training captain. I think that was just that. and and this, so they also had problems. So it's not just the pilot who is junior, it's the pilots who meant to be representing the system. So the discussions in the pubs and behind start taking place, and the words start getting out saying it's not the pilot error, it's something else. And after every flight, pilots would record what was happening. They would literally memo of what modes were happening, studying it together in flight while they were flying, and then started to report that this mode switched off, that shouldn't have happened, and then the aircraft behaved that way, and they will take over, with a full manual. But the problem is that some airports would only accept in some approaches because of low visibility or because of how it would accept the flight for safety because they would be too close, for example, landing after each other. That will have to be automated landing. So all of that was happening, and I was fascinated to understand what pilots are thinking. And the problem was the pilots were underreporting the problem. They did not know what was happening in a way. They understood, but they couldn't explicate correctly. But also they couldn't articulate what was the problem because they couldn't fault themselves and they couldn't fault the aircraft. And I was lucky enough that I was working with Mary Omedy and Jim McLennan, who at the time was studying decision making in extreme environments in firefighters in Australia. And they decided, what if we put a camera on a firefighter, because some firefighters are successful and some firefighters, would lose the crew and themselves die or unable to save some people. So, but some would stay right into the last minute, and as soon as they walk out, let's say there is a catastrophic collapse or the fire will change its behavior and so on. And what they found out is that the firefighter wouldn't actually give them any more information that would help another, train another firefighter. So I took their methodology, modified it, because pilots have very limited time and don't want to spend too much time debriefing, because how did the landing go? Fine,
Yeah.
We've landed, we've parked.
Yeah.
And so it had to be very brief. And they started telling me things that they um, they could recollect, to the point that I forgot to tell my wife that somebody will come into the house today, and they would be, sitting sweating because they should have told their wife something, and they would remember this in flight. So their recollection would be so good that they would remember every consecutive thought that happened in flight. And that was flooding me with so much information and help. And I understood that what we have in cognitive engineering books saying of how we think and how we make decisions is actually not at all like that. We're not following decision tree. There's no logic, straight logic or linear thought. And they were, I could also understand what information they were picking up and what they were losing. And then the ghosts in the cockpit started to disappear in a way, because they started to understand what they were processing, what they were missing, and we could unravel the puzzle. And of course, I was not the only one doing it. It was the team across, in the United States, in Europe, in Australia. They say English speaking because I was working in the English speaking, and of course, other languages in Europe would have worked. And I'm sure in Spain, sort of, Spanish, Portuguese.
Really interesting ideas there. Some of them I'll have to come back to as I kind of build through some of these questions. But I like that idea that you've mentioned of the incremental technology through mobile phones. So I remember 25 years ago, my first mobile phone was. I got a mobile phone quite young. I was really keen to have a mobile. I had a pager when I was a child. I don't, you know, what a pager, yeah. Like I
Of
wanted a
course.
pager. My dad had one. I thought it was cool, and I was a weird kid. But I had a mobile phone really young, and it was big brick with buttons. You couldn't text message. I remember getting a notification one day to say SMS messaging was coming soon. No idea what it was. You made a phone call and that was it, and it was really simplistic technology. And that obviously reminds me, you're talking about pilots who had loads of clock dials. I think we can all imagine some of those really old aircraft we may have seen inside in the movies or TV shows, and it's just all lots of little circular dials, um, little arrows flicking about, and you don't know what any of it means. But with mobile phones, like you say, we had 25 years of changing through the buttons going away, the buttons moving about, phones starting to get bigger, then starting to get smaller, and we adapted to that along with time. Then you have a pilot, like you say, who overnight almost goes from those old clock dials to this brand new technology. It's screens everywhere, there's colour, there's flashing lights, there's a whole new way of working, and that must be incredibly difficult to do. I mean, my mobile phone is very unlikely to, on a daily basis, decide whether I live or die, whereas a pilot literally has the lives of not only himself, his crew, the people on board, the people potentially on the ground to think of. That's a lot to risk. So let's get into some of this then. So I wonder, let's talk about astronauts at the moment, because that's been a part of your job, and they are trained to operate in probably the highest stress and highest stakes environments we know, going out of orbit into space. How do you prepare them for the unexpected when you're speaking to astronauts? And also, I'll include dealing with unusual or unexplained phenomena.
Of course, mm, these people choose this job because it is that, because of this novelty, because of challenges, because they could learn a lot, because they can operate novel technology. Actually, novel, not everything in space, some of it is very archaic because it's reliable. But the circumstances and technology surrounding it, or people who are thinking forward and contemplating of potential scenarios that may go wrong, is what on your mind all the time. Such as with pilots as well, they always consider what could possibly go wrong. So that mentality is absolutely true in space domain or airspace domain. So all engineers and all the pilots and all the mission control always think, what could go wrong? How can we prevent it? And with astronauts, the idea is that part of work that I was doing is looking how to assist them in creative problem solving. And we were preparing a program for creative problem solving on the missions to the moon and Mars. And the concept is that you have very minimum resources. So you cannot take supplies, nor can't you plan for all possible errors to go. So you had to be using your own resources. And at the time, I had colleagues they were working in Novosibirsk in this amazing, I would say, hub of academics in Soviet Union. And they happened to travel in the same city as I was, and we were just met because we had Russian language in common. And I invited them to work on this project because they were biologists, but also they were working on theory of innovative problem solving. And that was developed by Ad Schuler, who used to work in the patent office and similar to Einstein. And he saw that people filing patents have solving the problems in the same way, but in different domains. And he started to pull principles together. And these principles then allowed to be applied cross-domain. And when these, my colleagues Olga and Nikolai Bogatyrev, they were thought that what if we look on how nature solves problems versus how we human think. So this is two different mentalities, if you wish, or consciousness, if we go into that domain. And they started to distill on if, let's say, there is a contradiction in lifting weight. Yeah, for example, it's one example. How would a human do this? And or how many ways the human can do this, and how many ways nature would do this, even considering ants, how much weight they lift, or you think of how elephants are lifting weight, is very different, or how the tree lifts the weight. It also does lift the weight. And this principle became so different. I believe it was something like 75% of solutions were different in nature on how it resolved it, using only resources available. And that's why it was much more applicable to space. We don't discount how we make decisions or how we do creative problem solving. But if we consider how nature solves problems and help us, because through this methodology, which they've called biotrees because it's biology, it's not quite biomimicry, but it's using nature as principle. It's not mimicking it, but using principles. Then we've put this into a software and a prototype and gave it to work with with astronauts, with European astronauts. And we happened to be at NASA when we were doing this prototype testing, because, of course, although these are European astronauts, where do they train? They train for missions to go at NASA mostly, or a majority of their time. They're actually not in their home, which is Cologne, the astronaut center. And what we found that all of them had, because of their background, so one of them was a shuttle background or learning, or they were all pilots and engineers. The other astronaut was trained on Mir. It was that far along. And the other astronaut was younger and he was trained on Soyuz, because that was for a long time the only way to go and come back from space. And all of them had different way of thinking. So when we gave them a problem, they all came up with different solutions. And that's a beauty, because in spaceflight, you want to have all the options and then to choose, because you will be limited by resources, by time, by how effective, how long, and how many other systems it will affect. So this then, that was also then spurred into training programs, as part of thinking of how to creatively problem solve.
How often does the subject of unexplained phenomena come up when you're speaking to pilots or astronauts, particularly? Is that something that you can have a conversation about? Are you expected to have a conversation about? You mentioned obviously being there at NASA as well. Do UFOs come up?
No. So the idea is that you have to find an explanation to what the cause might be. And because my work was mostly on the ground, so it was mostly in preparation rather than supporting in flight. So perhaps that's my, if you wish, limitation of exposure to some of the stories. But because I'm also a psychologist, and for that, even a clinical psychologist, it is a very, it's threatening, similar, like I have explained when I spoke with Ryan Graves, that there is this expectation that if you say that you can't or think in the way that it is expected, you might be grounded or lose your license to fly, medical license. And people talk, unfortunately, unfortunately, there's still that um, not always protection of each other, but competition. But pilots are found, and anyone in airspace are more camaraderie, like they're more helping each other rather than going against each other. So people are very quiet if they're struggling with something, if it might affect them. So they will talk either hush hush or to their friends and colleagues. And that's why I was comparing the problem where we had ghosts in the cockpit, because they were afraid to speak up because they would have lost their job. But once there were more of them and they've started to describe the problem, they had something to work with themselves, but also to go back to manufacture.
How would you approach that difficult conversation then? You mentioned speaking with Ryan Graves and other pilots on this, and there's a huge stigma, I believe, that I think we know is still there when talking about the UFO topic. And it's interesting you hear, obviously, pilots being scared to report it. They don't want to lose career progression. They don't want to have their colleagues diminish them. They don't want to be laughed at. An interesting idea would be on occasion pilots may use that against colleagues. Well, I want a promotion and Ia's going for the same promotion. Well, Ia's seeing UFOs when she's up there. Do you really want her progressing through the ranks? And that can be used against them. How would you approach that conversation with a pilot or an astronaut to say, what would you ask them to say actually, or what would you recommend?
I just want to go back just for a second to say that I have actually not heard a story where the pilots would do this backstabbing to each other ever.
Sure.
Not in my experience, just to say, but I'm just saying that if other people might hear it, I don't know, because it's a conversation, you don't know who listens
There's a
to your
potential for
conversation.
that to happen, yeah.
Yes, exactly, yes. And mm, so also just something came up, and I will come back to answering to your question, that
Sure.
as part of Ryan Graves' effort, if you know, Ryan organized, well, his passion is to protect his colleagues, and he was part of safety effort where he was working as well. So as soon as he was able to, he went to a professional body, which is American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA, and pulled together a team which is growing bigger and bigger with every year. And part of the team, there was a human factors team. And as that part of human factors effort, we wrote a paper which has only just been approved. It took that long to get it done. We did have some conference papers, but this is an official white paper that's published on the website with our suggestions. As a team of experts, we even have a medical professional as part of the team. We have also air crew as part of that team who had their own experience of UAP while flying and were told not to do. So the people who actually went through the process themselves as aircrew. And that paper is widely accessible if you go into either via Ryan Graves, American Safe Airspace, I think Americans for Safe Airspace, or AIAA, and look for UAP effort. And that provides recommendations of what could be done and what kind of problems pilots face as well. And so now to answer your question, how do you start the conversation? Did you say?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
how do you have that conversation to say, if they do see something, should they report it? Would you recommend they do? Do you help them deal with an experience or something unusual that they maybe are wrestling with?
Yes. So we do touch that in the paper as well, as in terms of recommendation for the organizations, but also so if the pilots read it, they can also talk about this as an option. First of all, I would recommend to speak with colleagues that they feel comfortable with, because by sharing that experience, it makes you more confident you're not alone. And that's why then you don't have to remain in that thought, did I see it? Did I not see it? And often people dismiss that experience because they say, well, I'm so busy, and it kind of falls into the foreground or background, and people only remember it if somebody else saying it or says, oh yeah, you're right, I completely forgot. And often you do come across those experiences when people hear somebody else's and they say, oh, that makes sense, now I can relate to what has happened. And but also our mind is very protective of us, and it would also, what we couldn't put into our construct of reality, it will just almost dismiss it. It's actually blind us. It's blindness to the situation. And we do have this. There are many type of blindness, that like attentional blindness is one. Is sort of, if you don't want to see it, you will not see it, and there are many experiments related to that in psychology. But because the pilots are so alert and they're trained to watch more than you and I don't know if you fly, but if we are bound by Earth, we actually don't see objects when we get into the aircraft or when we are passengers. We scan like that. Our vision is almost like a horse. If horse has blinkers here, we have blinkers here. But the pilots don't have blinkers. They see, the sphere. They see the objects right round. So when I'm flying with an instructor, the instructor more often would spot something before I do, because they have much more experience. And this has happened when we were filming for the PBS, the public broadcasting system. They were filming about the UFOs in the UK, and we went up just to discuss and to show how it might not, appear. And the pilot flying with me, who is also not just the aircraft pilot, but fixed wing, he's also a helicopter pilot, and he saw objects way before, I would have even looked. It's because of his professional scanning, and I am just a private, pilot license, and I am also not is a way as responsible as he is for the flight. And so we were discussing what we would notice and not notice. So the pilots definitely would notice, but whether they will file it as unusual or threat is different. So you could see objects, but you would dismiss them because they're too far away. You're too busy doing calls. You're too busy planning, or you've got crew coming asking something. Depends on which part of the flight. But if you are cruising, for example, cross Atlantic or Pacific flight, you have time. So that's when you could look, towards Big Dipper, which is a lot of activities apparently could be happening around the Big Dipper. So it's that first aspect. People might not see it at all. Second is that whether once they mention it, what happens with their crew that they're sitting with, are they able to discuss it or not? And then if they say, I don't want to talk about this, where do you go from there? And they often change, so they don't fly with the same person. They rarely often fly with the same person, depending on how big is their company. And so that all of that cascades, whether that you begin the conversation or forget it about, talking about it at all. But speaking to people who have already experienced it is better, or speaking to friends. You don't even have to speak to colleagues, just to for you to feel comfortable to say that this has happened, just to be acknowledged. But also, there is an aspect of when we tell the story, it gets modified every time in our mind. The way we tell the story, the way the details that we're able to tell or not, and not everyone able to retain the original story. Not because they have bad memory, it's just the way we're wired. So, and so choosing the person that you can tell authentically is the key. Or maybe not even tell the story and write it down or record it or draw it. Different people have a different way of capturing it, because there is granularity of the experience that's much richer than what we can capture in words or transfer to anyone. And that richness actually is where the key is held. It's not just that we saw the light. There is multi-layer experience that some of it is very hard to put into words.
So, from a cognitive psychology perspective, how reliable is human perception when observing or reporting extraordinary phenomena?
I'd say very reliable because these are experts observers. We're not talking about somebody who don't know how to describe the flying objects, don't know the characteristics. They're very reliable. You could have, so they have experienced all possible, something that could fool their perception. They have experienced that in their flying career. The glare from the window, the lights that are in the cockpit reflecting in the actual glass, and so on. So everything that you could explain, or weather balloon, I mean, they've seen it all. Unless you're absolutely novice flying, they would have come across in their flying career, because they approach, airports, they fly across. Some of them have come from military aviation or different type of aviation. Some of them, like I have come across pilots who fly a helicopter. They see things very differently in how they move. They're just perception, they're clued differently. So I think we're very gifted, I would say, or we're very lucky as community to have these experts sharing what they're seeing or experiencing, because it's not only seeing.
An interesting aspect of your role, and again, I'm going to use the astronauts here because pilots would be a little bit less likely in this scenario. You're preparing astronauts for different challenges for like the mission to Mars, which would be like 520 days. There's a lot that would go into that, physically, psychologically. But is there any element of preparing? This is very speculative, but what if they did come into contact with something non-human?
Yes, it's my favorite topic. uh, because I think that contemplation, just thinking about it, what what would you say? How would you act? How would you anticipate you would be contacted? All of that comes into play. As far as I am aware, at the European Astronaut Center, that was not discussed, not trained for. So perhaps individually, people, whether they allow for that possibility or not, they discuss that either with colleagues or contemplate on that level. So to say that no, we don't train for that,
Do you
as far
think
as
that's
I'm
a
aware.
would you recommend that should be trained for? Because that seems like, while it's an extreme circumstance, given what they're doing, it would seem logical to at least entertain the notion.
I think so, because so if we think of safety, for safety, we train pilots to such a degree that this is actual words of astronauts, is when they walk up to the rocket, they feel they're superheroes. They're better than superheroes. And that's not just their, you know, I don't know, ego
Ego.
speaking,
Yeah.
or yeah, but or that they're superior. No, it's because the team on the ground and previous crew have designed so many potential safety training scenarios of what could go wrong. They have tested for all of that, over and over, and increased their speed reaction and increase the potential ways of resolving that error. So we give them this an amazing, gorgeous um, something like to fall into during the crisis. And during crisis, most important is not to freeze, because it's not flight or fight, it's freeze first. And by having that experience of um, knowing what to do, at least first three steps, or at least even one step would be sufficient to walk out from that freeze zone. So if you know what to do first, then the rest, your mind will get into its efficient mode of operation, and it will be able to work with you to come up with what resources are available, what I can do, and how I can best respond. Not just respond, but be effective in that, or efficient. And so I think if you haven't thought of what to do, then you don't want that freezing face, especially in a situation like that. So I'd imagine, in a way, we've been trained through Hollywood and film industry on what possibly could happen, or if you watch or grow up on Star Trek and variety of, there was a Stargate, all of those programs. I guess there is this element of knowing, but unless we go through the motion ourselves, it is slightly further in our processing, if you wish. It's not as a foreground, just like in martial art. Some things you do because it's just the natural thing to do, because that's what you've done thousands of times. And that's the same thing here. So if you know what to do, you don't need to think about it in the first instance, meaning that you are faced and you're not shocked. That's, it is a reaction. You don't go through that reaction, or it's minimal in its time and impact on you, and you can walk from there. So absolutely, I would think it's very helpful to, as a minimum, to put it on the table as a question, and go through the people you will be trusting, each of you are trusting your life to, and mission control, and see what people would say, see what kind of interaction there could be, what kind of questions they would want to ask, what kind of questions they anticipate, how will they be communicated, will there be questions at all, what would they do? We know now some of the phenomena interacts with us in feeling sense. So what do you do with that? We're not trained how to deal really with our experiences that flood us chemically, the emotions that we only train that ourselves throughout our life. How do you deal? mm, let's say a lot of astronauts and pilots have the fear, in a way, that fear that freezes you doesn't come up as often, but it depends what circumstances we come with or come up with. But maybe fear is not even the problem. What if you're overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude and love and connection? And we know that with Jake Baber, who described that, and he felt that he's actually maybe not fit to fly. Why? Like, why do we have to deal with this on our own? And why can't we share that with colleagues and contemplate about that?
One of the interesting ideas I've heard you discuss, and you've touched on it here a little bit, is that idea of when a pilot uh, becomes so. Uh, I don't know if intuition's the word, but there's a connection between them and their aircraft. And this is something we hear about when people are talking about non human intelligence, UFOs, and aliens, that perhaps entities are connected psychically, telepathically to a craft, and that's how they operate it. However, you're talking about it in terms of pilots of helicopters or of fighter jets. They have they have a connection to their craft? And do you believe it goes beyond skill and just, well, I've got 10,000 hours of flight experience? There's something there. There's a real connection to the actual craft itself.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And pilots do describe this flying by the seat of the pants. So they are feeling the airframe. And a lot of pilots who love flying, they would go to fly the lighter aircraft so they could actually feel the air, feel the airframe and work with that. And often when you're driving the car, I mean, we can compare that when we are cycling, doesn't matter. You or when you are, a child, they don't have to be a child, but when you are roller skating, you are so much above the ground suddenly, but you still connect to the ground and you still feel your feet or those little wheels still part of you connecting to the ground. So the same is that if you get into the car or change the car, buying it smaller or bigger, you do have that perception yourself, or at least I do. And people I spoke with, we often talk about that, some people cringe if they come too close to a bush or another car and their wing mirrors are too close. So same thing here. When you are flying, that's one sense about landing, for example, that you are learning not about how you are coming to the ground, which is a very different perception. It's a perspective, but you are watching how fast the ground is coming up to you. And that's very different. And by that rate, and you're not watching it, you can't see that rate forward. You have to watch it with your peripheral vision. And you do know, well, maybe what our eyes are actually seeing in black and white in peripheral space. But if I look, I can see that my sweater, is colored the same way, although I'm looking through my peripheral vision. But it's my brain coloring it. It's not actually physically possible. So, and then what you're looking for is you're looking at the wings as how fast they are approaching the ground, because that's the reference. You can't see it again from your eyes on how fast the ground is coming up, but you're almost feeling it with your feet because you're, I don't know, you're feeling the airframe moving, and that feeling makes you feel as if you are an aircraft. But people have, as we now know, people have feelings of synesthesia, and synesthesia is when you have one sense interpreted through the other. So, for example, I hear a sound, but I see color, or I see shape, but it represents to me in color. So and there are now 150 pairings that are discovered, which before was discounted as abnormal. So you shouldn't be seeing that or hearing that or feeling that. So people would, for example, take the glass and they would drink the liquid, and they will have sensations that are that we're not used to describing, but they are internal, down to their toes, and they would be able to say what's inside this drink, for example. And all of that allows you to perceive space not in the same way for all of us. So if there are 150 pairings of mixing of how we see, how we hear, how we taste, proprioception, thermoception, and so on, then we possibly can feel the vibrations that other people don't. And that could be from, a tail, from the wing, I don't know, from the nose, or some people, how they perceive the airflow might interpret this in a certain way that we don't. And that you can't learn in the office. You have to go sit down and go through these touchdown landings, let them go wrong, get the crosswind, and slowly you will be coached And if the pilot is also having those extrasensory, not but synesthetic pairings, they will start telling you, can you feel the ground coming up? They don't say, can you see the ground? Can you feel the ground coming up? And can you see the wing, let's say, shifting or tipping? Can you see the color change? And so all of that gradation they will be describing to you, and you will start picking your own cues because you're seeing they're not relying just on forward, keys on the runway and so on. So you're starting to sense. So I think it's very much, we could describe it. It's not like we can manipulate the airframe by our body, but then there is, there are people who can affect matter. I don't know, but I haven't come across this myself in aviation. But there are pilots who describe, if you read stories, that it felt like they were able to. They had no other explanation of why the airframe done or the aircraft managed to pull that far, and they shouldn't have. So something was happening.
Wonder when they get to that stage where you can fly a helicopter, a fighter jet, you can pilot a spacecraft or whatever it may be, and you have that level of connection. Does that change who the person is? And then that must go into their daily lives. That when they come off the aircraft or they land the helicopter, they don't just jump for a coffee, go home, and have a normal life. That must change them and how they just perceive everything round about them.
Yes, that's also a very good observation. Absolutely. The way we think, our profession or our experiences modifies our cognitive processing and also our perception. And it's neural wiring. So it's specific paths in our brain that, let's say, we use more often, and they become highways, and we rely on them more on how we think. And a pilot or people in extreme environments or professions that we don't even have to say, surgeons, police, paramedics. There are many professions that builders, they have to think about what could go wrong, when the building site, and they think of safety. And the same thing is here. So we have the pilots often, and astronauts as well. They would be, for one, which is quite interesting, with astronauts, it's almost like nothing is impossible and no job is too small because they have to be a tradesman they have to be, what's the expression? Being able to do all the trades.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes. Well, I think they are master of
But they
many.
have to be a master. Yeah, I was going to say, but they have to also
Yes.
be a master of them. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're also humble, meaning that if it doesn't work or they don't know, they'll go find out. But they are able to multitask. So they will, if the washing machine broke, they'll take it apart and put it together. They would be more fascinated about the process of how to fix it because that's how their mind works. They're fascinated to find out. If they've got the time, they will always engage, and they engage fully. There is almost like there's none of them outside of working with that problem. But of course, they're very much aware of the environment at the same time. And they're learning how to use resources. So it's a skill. And I would admit, to me, it's I guess maybe a little bit of humor that I find that when we become parents, it's a really good training for a space mission because you have to multitask in so many ways. You don't sleep, you stay hungry, you have to organize an entire household and sometimes many more other parents, and you still have to perform in an extraordinary way and problem solving. And these little alien beings that start asking you very unusual questions, or a lot of for a major part of their early life, they don't talk either. So it's
We're
quite
going to get to
interesting.
that as a topic
Okay.
in just a little while.
Oh, no worries.
But just to take the previous idea a little bit further, so from the human to the non-human, the idea that humans, when they train to be pilots and they go through these changes and they have these states of hyper awareness, hyper vigilance, intuition, gut feeling, all whatever you want to call it, all kind of becomes like a thing, like a oneness for them. If you want to imagine Neo in the Matrix when he finally clicks and everything goes slow for him and he's got this kind of control of his environment. If you take that to a non-human place, would it be likely, do you think, to speculate that pilots of craft who perhaps are visiting the Earth or based here would behave differently to the native beings wherever they are from because they would have similar experiences, similar levels of skill, control, or could we not apply that?
Are we talking right now about the potential pilots of these unusual crafts? Is that what you're
Of like
saying? Can
non-human
we?
craft, yeah. Would they have similar attributes? Do you believe then that their behaviours would be similar to our pilots who behave in a different way once they have those kind of skill levels and that awareness of their environment?
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting connection to make, and it would be good to ponder and discuss the qualities. Yes, I mean, if they have a way to manipulate the craft the way that we can't, of course, those expertise and those perceptions, and I mean, we don't know, how highly skilled, let's say, their general population is, and whether these are selected beings or mm, you know they just all of them pilot craft let's say, of where they're from, or maybe these are there's suggestions that it's interdimensional, or there are many theories of where it could be possible from. So but I think it's interesting to extrapolate what their mentality might be, but then we're making a lot of assumptions. So our assumptions, or this connection that we're making, is making us not to consider potential boundaries when we're more like children in our perception, but not discounting our experience, of course, but seeing things for what they are. Then our mind doesn't color it, just like my sweater being colored, although I should be seeing black and white. So the same applies in our daily. It's economical for our brain not to think over new things that we already know. So that's the only reason why we see and don't see, or pay attention or don't pay attention, because it's either not threatening or not useful, or we've got very busy life, and we discount a lot of beauty as a result. So yeah, I think I love to explore this territory of how they might think. In fact, if they think, and if it's direct telepathy, and there is no this expectation that you don't know what I think, and maybe it's all one, um, as a forego. So maybe for I mean, maybe for dogs, it's unusual even, that we don't know what they're thinking, because maybe dogs know what they all thinking. We don't know that
Yep.
still, right? So we don't know if for them it's strange that you and I can't read each other's thoughts, that they'll be standing in front of us and will have a completely different thing, thinking, and there'll be no crossover. So how do we appear when we don't share the qualities that they do share? We look alike, but we're completely, I don't know, lack certain abilities that they assume we have.
Yeah.
Because they might have that assumption too. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, it's interesting. So it's like us studying another, even coming to another culture. We don't have to even having not even another species, but just coming to another culture of how do we. So the project we had was about English language and misunderstanding during operations in a multilingual environment. And what has happened is that the the European population that spoke English, which is not a native language, had minimal to no misunderstanding, versus the British and the US had most misunderstandings, and they were operating differently. And that was because of how they used to operate, how they were trained professionally, and also how what assumptions we make about each other's role. Where people who have English not as a first language, they had an anticipation that the other person also not native in English, and they will either be unable to communicate properly, so they made sure that every term they communicated, they've explained it, and they assumed they didn't understand, so they asked additional questions. So that removal of assumptions that go in concepts, because it was conceptual misunderstanding rather than word misunderstanding, so semantic. And that once that was understood, I don't think it has eliminated the problems, but it highlighted the problem where we make assumptions where we shouldn't. And that is a lot of our problems, that we come in with our framework of how we think other people perceive reality, and then we apply that they can't see with the back of their head, for example, or we assume that dog can smell, but what if they're not only just smelling? What about if they're sensing in other ways? So all of that almost limits our reaction or interaction, and I would say limits the way we can interact together, and limits the potential for joy and play and connection.
That's probably a nice segue into a chat around telepathy. I know this is something you have an interest in. I've got Kai Dickens, who we're probably going to bring up from the telepathy tapes. She's coming on the podcast next week, and she's going to be discussing the work that's coming out with Telepathy Tape Season 2, the documentary that's being filmed with Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell involved. Of course, it's largely her work. But what's your take on that whole situation? The idea that these children with various disabilities have extrasensory perception, telepathy, skills. I found it fascinating. The idea of the hill, no doubt you're going to get into that as well, is incredible. And for me, it was something that when I spoke to Kai, a family friend of ours, she lost her daughter just a couple of years ago, who was around, I think Jessica was around 14, and she was completely non-verbal, several different disabilities I wouldn't go into, so never was able in her whole life to speak to her mother in her short life. But if you ask her mother, they had a connection and they could communicate in a way that wasn't the norm for everyone else.
I like it. I like this topic because um, this mother who had a connection with her daughter, and unfortunately, there is this life expectancy which is short, unfortunately, and that's devastating. Having your children go before you, and of course, it's horrific for children to lose parents too. But yeah, I'm sorry for the loss of your friend. Um, so what I wanted to touch on is the way Kai Dickens brought. Perhaps it's not just Kai, but I think Kai is making this, popularizing it, in communicate this beautifully, and they're saying it, assume competency. So these are not children with disability, how we perceive it, and we then assume that they don't know anything. And what we find out is completely the opposite. They know more than we do. So if we walk in to a room and assume that everybody's competent, rather than they are unable to do something, and that's where I think a child's perception, or if we remember ourselves as children as far as we can, keeping our expertise and knowledge, but that perception and non-judgmental approach would help us a lot with meeting another person. It doesn't have to be an alien or a person from different culture or different abilities. But what I found interesting is that people whom I've spoke about this when I started to listen and understand more and more, they said, oh no, I don't want anybody to read my mind. And I think that's the way we grow up, because in a way that people keep secrets, they have to keep secrets the way society is built. We're not discussing everything, or we're not allowed, or it's not acceptable to discuss certain topics, although there's nothing wrong with some of the topics that we can't discuss. I mean, we're talking about UAP, right? If people are experiences, why not discussing it? Why certain topics, like when you go to a party, right? You're not supposed to talk about certain topics, or when you're meeting the person first, because that might ethically, you might step on somebody's feelings. So the same thing here. And wouldn't that be beautiful that this new findings, our findings, we're way behind this children or this people with disabilities, that they're opening up, that we should be reading each other's thoughts, and there shouldn't be secrets, and there should be openness, and there should be love and connection, and we don't need to hide things. If we just remember how, if you can just imagine how much we can let go, relax, and exhale for how many things we don't need to filter when we need to speak, it would be much more beautiful conversation, much more connection, and we will learn from each other much more. So I think having this beautiful tsunami, I would say, coming from that Kai is generating with this momentum. And, Diana Hennessy Powell has been building this, and I'm sure other researchers and teachers and carers who have went through this have been bringing this forward. This is allowing us to rethink our reality in a, I would say, more kind way, that if we could think. And what I really like, that what Kai is saying and the families are saying, that these can be used against them, that they feel that they're protected and connected. And that is what is of interest to me. I had this once experience of well, as a human as well, but also as an extraordinary experience when I was doing constellation work. So there is a system called family constellation. It's a therapeutic method. I believe it's actually originated in Africa, because the person who brought this method, it will come to me the name. So he brought the system. He was a priest, and he was spreading the Christian word in Africa. And he brought this method of therapy called family constellation. And family constellation is when other people assume a role of the person that you need to make amends with, in a way. But there are many ways you can do this. But an assumption is that people who are willing to participate in this, you have a question that, for example, you want to resolve, or a problem, or an anxiety or repeating challenge that you come across, and you bring this to the circle. There is a leader or person who facilitator, rather than a leader, facilitator, and they would discuss with you to get kind of to the feeling that is most closest of when that discomfort that you feel, or that feeling that you want to resolve. And then they decide the earliest when you felt that, and you then remember the situation that you felt that feeling in, and you put people in a in those roles and ask them to willingly to participate. They have to agree. You ask them, could you? They say, yes, I would. And they will come into a circle. You will place them where you feel you are in relation to them. And that builds a constellation. That's why it's called family constellation. And then in that situation, people start feeling and saying things, not knowing anything about that person, because these are not family members, of what that person experienced then. and it's extraordinary experience of somehow doing things that you didn't assume any, and the less you assume, the better, the more therapeutic it becomes. And you're not punishing anybody, you're not saying bad things. It's not about that. It's about finding the space to feel the feelings that we didn't feel. And the reason I'm talking about this, because one of them was in one of those experiences, I was walking up to a figure that was part of me, and I started to experience light, just a lot of extraordinary presence. It just suddenly, and I could see everything in the room, and that was overpowering the space around me. And I felt such extraordinary, I guess, bliss is the way that you would describe it, or I could describe it. But more so, I could see many of us, like many of us. It was an infinite space of, and I could see in my eyes mind, I guess, but it was overlooking physical reality, I would say, to me, or overlaying. And that feeling of having relaxation or exhalation came from is that every one of those particles or beings or light knew what all of us knew. So we had one feeling, one sense, one reality. And there was the feeling was this, that you don't need to hold on to anything. Everything is known. We know everything. And you don't need to explicate or worry about anything, because everything is available in regard of a mental space for me and feeling space. And it felt, as often is described in this type of experiences, is that it felt, the best I could describe is like coming home. And it's not the home that I was born in. It's not the loved ones that I've here. It's had a different quality. And that experience of not needing to explain, or that everything is known and you can let go of everything. I wish that people experience this feeling that you don't need to hide anything ever again. And we will all be so much better as humanity. And I think these children are bringing this possibility for us to experience this, to experience that you don't need to hold on to what if they read that part of your mind. Assume that they have, what the worst that could happen if they did. And I think part of this telepathy with these entity space, or entities who might be piloting the craft, who might be in a parallel dimension or part of the phenomena, or communicating, I think the fear that, this is my assumption, you see, this is an assumption, that we are feeling that we have something to hide, there's something, other agenda to have. And having no agenda, as the child would, and having no assumptions, and assuming that, all the adults are superhumans because we can do these extraordinary things, right? For a child, we are, Superman, Superwoman, and we can lift things, we can create amazing meals, and I don't know, drive the car, fly a plane, and if we come with that attitude, then there is no need to to have a second agenda that meets another agenda. And then possibly I feel the telepathy would become much easier because we construct the barriers, we construct the concepts, we assume we can't do things. And we know when people say, I can, they really can do extraordinary things, despite what the medicine says, despite what your physical trainer says, and despite what technology says. So I think there is something for us to learn with this new findings that Diana Hennessy Powell and Kai Dickens and all the families and children and those who are adults now bringing us as gifts.
It's a really interesting experience you had as well, and it reminded me a little bit of what Jake Barber, who you mentioned earlier, he had this experience when he was flying and came close to a craft. You weren't having an experience with a UAP or UFO, but it was something similar, and I often wonder that idea of all coming from whatever consciousness is one big ocean, and you come out of it for a short time. And I think if you scoop a glass of water out of the ocean and take it round the world with you for 80 years, that glass of water is going to have all these different experiences, go to different places, all different vibrations, whatever you want to call it. And then at the end of that 80 years, if you take the glass of water and throw it back in the ocean, that it just goes back to source with all those experiences and takes it back in. And I wonder, is that similar to our consciousness? For me, that would help begin to explain ideas like you had, where you go into like a oneness, what people experience with after life after death sort of experiences. The idea of the hill, with the children that Diane Hennessy Powell and Kai Dickens are discussing. They've got this almost chat room that they can go to in their minds, wherever it may be. That's the way I like to think of it, that they go and connect with each other, but they just don't have, like you say, those limitations that seem to be put upon us from early years. Frameworks, I think, was a good word you used earlier, that you stick to. But other cultures, depending where you are in the world, don't see these ideas as being as silly or incredible as perhaps folks in the West would. And they're much more open to, well, yeah, these are just, you've got a physical reality and a non-physical reality, and you can access different elements of those. So yeah, I'm really intrigued by that idea, and I just want to, before we run out of time, a couple of things I want to get on to talking. You do have an upcoming book, and you've talked about your work, especially with young children, around intuition, the idea that children don't arrive for us to shape them as adults, but for the children to shape us. Do you want to just discuss that a little bit? Because you've kind of touched on it, I think, before.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely. I feel that children and us as children, because we were children, and its part exists in us, and the young generation, the children born every second around the world, and they are coming up. If we can assume that there is or some people, some religions actually do say that there is a grander reality or consciousness that exists and looks after all of us, and we are part of it, then these are, if you wish, like you were talking about molecules in the ocean, then these children allow us to almost renovate and reconsider our concepts that we have constructed. So when children ask us something very genuinely, very innocently, it's that truth that is at the most core of our reality. They're really asking us, does it really exist? Do you still believe in it? And it's a beautiful time to reevaluate, is that actually true? And they put us on the spot to reevaluate who we are, how we behave, to open up our perception, and to also breathe differently, live differently, have a different lookout. And they allow us to almost take that spiritual path, or it doesn't have to be called spirituality, but it's about reevaluating who we are as a human being and also as a society. A lot of parents change their roles, even from birth, in terms of their professional roles. It is like having having a child born, I would say it's probably similar for some people as having an overview effect for an astronaut. Because they change your reality of what matters, and that what matters continues to be questioned through children bringing us every time. And it's not about fitting the children into our reality, it's about reconstructing our worldview. So we had a chance to shape it for our parents in a way, if we did, or maybe they shaped more us, but it doesn't matter. It's our opportunity to reevaluate and open our eyes to what the universe is actually like and what could we be like. And if we uh, pause before saying our answer, it's a training in actual mindfulness. And a lot of things that, as I started to experience in Eastern philosophies, I'm Korean medicine practitioner. I studied Eastern philosophies. I studied Japanese philosophies through Aikido, and I studied different cultures and traditions because I started to be interested in consciousness, on how they perceive reality in First Nation in North America and also South America. And I am fascinated on how they perceive children. And that gave me an opportunity to start comparing what we think of children in every different culture. And I compare that as well through the classes that we run. And the book was actually not intended to be born. It was born because parents were saying this needs to be wider than just a course. And so I started writing the book after I had already courses, and the discussions from parents went into the book, because I think it's through our conversation, through the discussion, that with our children, but also among ourselves, that we find similarities. Similarly, like in this family constellation practice, it is a conversation. And by you genuinely diving in without agenda, but really listening, and not having, let's say, with our children and with ourselves, with adults, a lot of times we're bound by time, but children are not bound by time. And it's our opportunity to reevaluate that. And they allow us to say, well, actually, do we have to leave now? Do we have to rush? Do we have to do this in this particular order? And then suddenly we find out, actually, no, we don't. It was just a construct. So they allow us to open that window that I found spiritual practices are teaching as well. So it's almost like having your own opportunity through our children. It's not that we don't offer them safety and protection and teach them about what we know, but it's about the mutual discovery of what the reality actually is. And I find that most beautifully, these children with spellers that Diana Hennessy Powell are bringing, and Kai Dickens, and all the families are starting to speak up, allowing us to reevaluate what our reality is. And that's what the book is about, is to studying our reality and also consciousness of what it might be. And when I start looking at all the traditions, it's through experience that you are advancing, not through reading. It doesn't mean you shouldn't read, but through the experience where our value systems are affected and we actually do something about it. And hence the UAP, and hence the children with these special abilities, and hence our children are being born and astronauts going to space, and extraordinary environments that we put ourselves in. All of that builds up to open our window of perception wider, and our spreading our sensors. So this book is my hope to just, or actually it's our joint wish from the group of participants, that people start perceiving this a bit more, start pausing before they say I know.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I've got three young children, all under the age of 10. So,
Oh,
yeah, the tiredness and all that kind of stuff. They're three very different children as well, very strong willed, all three of them. But yeah, I've tried to, I think, I wasn't a young dad. Like, I was 29, 30 when the first one was born. And they do teach you things. And I think I've really had to fight with myself to try and enjoy certain things. You know, sometimes you take them to a park and it's cold and it's wet and you can't be bothered being there because you're standing, not doing anything necessarily, but they're running about having a great time. And you think, well, actually, when I was that age, my parents done the same and they were probably a little bit bored, but I remember having a great time. I had fun. It's a great experience. I climbed up a big slide and went down that I didn't normally, and that made me braver because I could go up higher than I did before. And if I just say no and take them away, and my wife's always telling me this, the kids like to do that kind of stuff. I'm not very outdoorsy. I would spend all my time indoors. So yeah, they've definitely taught me a lot of stuff, and I'm trying to reframe the way I think about a lot of things, remembering what I remember as a child and really silly memories I've got of what was fun is the kind of things they are going through now, and just kind of allowing that to kind of help me look at things a little bit differently as well.
yes, beautiful. Yeah, so it's an invitation. The book is really a storytelling of these journeys of people, and it's touching different cultures and touching different phenomena on Earth, which we assume or take it for granted. And it blends all of that and allows you to find your story, because the deeper practices that come through Eastern philosophies, and actually any traditions, it doesn't have to be just Eastern philosophy, or it's about self-inquiry
Is there
and
a
self
is there a link yet for the book? It's not finished yet, so is it on pre-order?
Yes, it will be on pre-order. I'm sure it will be available on Amazon, but I'm still working on the date of release. But it is coming, and I'm already publishing some parts of it on Substack. So if people are curious, there are some elements with practical exercises that are already in the book that you can just take on board and go flow with it,
I'll put the
experiment,
links in the
explore.
description for folks so they can check those out as well. And just before we
Thank you.
finish off with some listener questions, Ia, you're presented at Sol in 2023. Now, your talk was about profound encounters people have had, but were underreported due to them not possessing the language to describe what had happened. Can you just talk a little bit about that before we mention this year?
Yes. The idea is that we are social beings, and when we explain something, we are framed by who is listening. Because naturally, just naturally, I'm not doing this on purpose, but I assume what you know, what your audience might know. Is it, who is likely to see it? And that frames of what I say, concepts I share, experiences I share, how I describe them, how far back into my history or the time frame will, all of that will determine of how I would talk. But in addition to that, we have something called pre-verbal knowing. And that I came across when working with pilots, is that, and also surgeons and astronauts, there is a piece of knowledge, we could call this intuition or intuitive knowing or professional intuition, that they, even surgeons, pilots, and astronauts did not know they do that, and or experience that. If you do that, same, well, similar domain. And what happens is that once you start explaining it to someone, or why they say, you become a better, stuff better once you start to teach it. It's because you are going through more detail or more granularities deeper into how you explain it, and you take different perspectives. And this allows the same thing with experiences, is that if we articulate them too early, we dismiss or almost like dishonor some of the feelings that we had, because we're not either comfortable to say it, either for ourselves because of our religion, traditions, values, the way we grow up, the society we're in. But if we could just contemplate on that and make it sacred, to provide the detail, to allow the space for that to emerge before we can speak, before we need to articulate it, and also be almost careful to whom we articulate in the first instance, so that because the preciousness of that carries clues to what that is, to what this experience and what that means. And if we almost like like when you break a bracelet, it falls apart into many grains, or when you spill the beans, yeah, literally, you are actually losing what it was in the beginning. And that beginning is most precious. And I feel that there is a lot of keys or clues that we're missing. So not articulating the experience too early is actually helpful. But in having a way to process it, I found the very useful way is to do breathing. Maybe I'm jumping a little bit,
No,
but
no,
what
that's
I
fine.
found is that, yeah. So in the previous session, I was saying is that what we're saying is colored by what other people are in front of us, and what we need to do is to either find a safe space when we can talk about this, or encapsulate it first, because we don't have experts like myself that could help you and put a camera on you before you have that experience, right? And then we go through it and see all the granularities of it. So what we are doing is we are preserving that experiences early enough so we can find the way to articulate it. And that's why people start having questions, and that's why they start reading and literature that might explain what happened or have the language to explain it. And what I feel is that we can find the language if we're given the time, and if we have the opportunity to process it in such a way that we can articulate it. And this is exactly what we were doing with pilots, surgeons, and astronauts, is that we're giving them space without rushing and judging, putting assumptions, and also value on the end, or price, or how could you say, a mark, is it good or bad? So if we don't have that, then we have a much richer way or opportunity to articulate the experience. And a lot of the time, why people go into the field and they want to, let's say, experience the UAP, or they go to places where they might have a phenomena experience, another type of phenomena, is because they feel that there's something more than to listening to it, rather than reading a story or hearing a story. And that does hold a key. In fact, it does.
So it's quite a natural follow-up then that this year at the third annual symposium at Lake Maggiore, I'm going to say Maggiore, which is just a couple of hours from Milan. I'm really excited to say I'm finally 5.5 years I've been doing the podcast, and I've never really been to like one of these big events. So this is the first time I'm going to get to go and meet people, and I'm really excited to do so. But you are speaking there, so I'll get to meet you in person. Yeah. The title of your talk is going to be "What if breath is the bridge between worlds, between the experience and what we can put into words?" Or that's certainly what Sol Symposium have on their site at the moment. So can you touch on what the plan is there?
Yes. So the discussion is a continuation from the previous talk on soul, because we were saying that people are unable to articulate certain things, and during this past few years, I've been working with therapists as well, and often why therapists are open to work with the people who have the phenomena, despite the stigma that they still have in the profession, and we still do, even in psychotherapy and practices, especially clinical practices. And these therapists themselves, they often had the experience, and that's why they're more open to have other clients come in and work with that. So we all need the support. So I originally was working with how can I assist us who are assisting others with the process to help us articulate our own. Because if we can't process our own, then our session becomes kind of a dual way, because we're trying to process what's happening with us. Our curiosity is still at play. It's not bad or good, but it is. We need to be conscious of that. So, and this allows their articulation and space by using breath, and often it's at the moment it's called breath work, but it exists in all traditions that I've come across, even in the Korean medicine that I studied. And pranayama, I guess, is one of the holotropic breathing is another. Iceman, like Wim Hofman techniques, and there are all of those techniques. But if you use them with a way to process your experience and integrate, it allows you to bring those feelings more to the place where you can start working with them and articulating them, but also understanding them. So they're not just haunting is probably not the right word, but they're not on your mind and you don't know what it is. But we could start bringing that ravine, that breach, between what we have experienced and what we want to articulate to others, to loved ones, so they could understand us. So it's a tool. So I mean, my work has always been about tools. It's about tools how to support the crew in space, tools how to present information to the pilot, and so it's all about finding the tool that we can understand ourselves and where we are, so we can become more kind to each other, really.
I look forward to hearing that in more detail in a couple of weeks' time. But listen, let's finish off with some listener questions. Thank you to everyone who sent over things for Ia. The first one we'll dive right in is from Theo. And Theo asks, and you've touched on an experience you had earlier in the family constellation, so maybe that. Have you experienced the paranormal or otherworld in your life? How has it shaped you? And has this been something that you must conceal from colleagues, or are you able to be transparent about such things in your work?
Yes, and this is a beautiful question, because if we are supporting others articulate their experiences, how, I think we become open once we have our own experiences, that we become more curious about it. And our listening ears, and all of our perceptors are much more receptive. So absolutely, I would not share certain things that I have experienced, even in martial art, with people, because it would be considered, there is an explanation for it. But that explanation is not enough for me. That's why I'm diving deeper. Yes, I see that explanation. It's my profession, but people often dismiss it because they have a concept. But that doesn't fit your conceptual framework, because you have experienced it slightly beyond, or slightly that is pushing or shattering those boundaries. So you're looking for an answer further. That's why it's important not to say it to people who will shatter you too early. So be precious about what you experience. It is not to be shared, but be that experience needs to be heard by humanity, by people, and that's why it needs to be revered and shared in appropriate circumstances, where you can fully explicate in the way that is helpful to you, to share the granularity of what happened, and for others people to hear. And yes, I did have other experiences which I'm still keeping it and processing it.
That's fair. Little glowing orb says, for Ia, does psychic potential increase in space? How so and why?
I don't know of the experiments, if that holds true, the hypothesis. I would be interested to explore, though.
It's something that's talked about, isn't it? The idea that there's something that happens once you're there, or outside of the Earth's gravity, or whatever that may be. But no, that's totally fair. Thank you for the question. Melly says, does the doc have some advice for experiencers that want to stay as silent as possible because the vast majority of family and friends will think they are mental if they say anything? So what would you say to experiencers who maybe are struggling or want to stay quiet?
Um, well, it's about how you're feeling. So if that, I guess this is the essence that we've touched on, and I feel it's precious that you experience. If you know you're not going to be listened to, it's probably not the helpful environment to start articulating your experience. So I think then it is better to find another way of expressing, or finding the people that will understand. And there are now more and more opportunities like that, where you can actually share. And if other, and also our problem that we have as humanity is that what other people think of us, because our social infrastructure depends on that. Then we are either not able to do our job or we are dismissed. So, but learning to deal with that in a way that is helpful for you. So don't put yourself in a spot where you would feel worse than you began. Look after yourself, nurture yourself. And then when people who may be not open to these experiences, they will come to it in their own time. Because forcing somebody, in front of what they want to see, it could be devastating for them too. There is a reason why they don't want to hear it.
Yeah, that's good advice.
If
That's very understandable. Two more questions. First up from Matthew for Dr. Whiteley. Encounters with UAP and potential NHI have implications for societal as well as individual psychological resilience. The infamous issue of ontological shock. How do you think government should be tackling the issue, and what role do you see for academia and the UFO research community in encouraging and supporting them?
Well, absolutely. And that's why this community that is part of the soul organizers, and there are other people who are, won't be able to make it to soul, or they're gathering in other places, and individuals like yourself, Andy, who are doing this podcast and spreading the word. People who work in the government, they're also listening. They might not be able to talk about this right now and in various positions. And it's about raising an understanding that experience exists if we can't put it into words, or into words that we can understand or process or apply our reality, laws of reality as we know it. It doesn't mean we don't go and study. There are a lot of unusual things. That's how science came about, or a lot of scientific discoveries came forth. As Tim Gallaudet, right, the oceanographer, who a rare admiral, retired rear admiral, speaks about that. I think he said that the volume, I think it's the modern mapping is like 25% of the ocean floor, but the volume of the ocean that's unexplored is something like we only explored 5%. So it's that much we don't know. And think of our volume of our mind. We don't even know where our mind is, where our thoughts rest. If you listen to Dean Radin, who is a Noetic Science Institute, used to be a scientific lead, but part of the Noetic Science of Institute of Noetic Science, who was founded by Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo astronaut. We could think of that we've only probably touched, a miniature percentage of our known capability. So it's the same thing, that
Yeah.
there's loads to explore.
No, that's really right. And I had a guest on quite recently who mentioned some work that was happening with Department of Defence, Department of Justice officials being interested. And after he mentioned it on this podcast, he then got in touch a day later to say the individuals had listened, and everything. It wasn't like there was anything sinister to it. But people do listen to these podcasts and watch these shows, and they are interested. So folks might not be aware of that and think this is all just fans of the topic, but there are scientists, academics, military folks, government folks who are looking at various different aspects of this topic and exploring it in different ways. So yeah, it certainly has a bigger interest, I think, than we even realise in the political realms and the academic realms and scientific realms. And final question, a nice one to end on, from Purple Burglar, which is the most difficult name for me to say. If you had the chance to script humanity's first conversation with the intelligence behind UFOs, not for TV but for real, what single question would you write for us to ask them, and why?
Yes, that's beautiful. Um, uh, it's a really tough one for me. I feel that it would be a feeling rather than a conversation. So I think to actually staying open as much as I can in my perception, and actually not starting to put concepts forward and asking questions, and staying like a child with curiosity, because our assumptions, which would form in my head if it's a telepathic conversation, would come from too much worry about, am I thinking the right thing? So I think I would go into martial art mode in regards to not for defensiveness, but in terms of perceptual mode of listening, or maybe even better to say as a Korean medicine therapist, or as a breathwork therapist, where I am purely present. I am just purely listening for whatever has to rise or come up, without anticipation and without reaction. I think that's the most useful to me. I would feel that would be productive, because as soon as I have my assumptions, there is like a chain reaction to what could happen. But if I'm willing and open and curious, then I think that's the way to start. I think if we go back to that scene in The Arrival, where I forgot the name of the doctor who was standing in front of this octopods, isn't it, or something they're called?
Yeah, tentacle creature. Yeah,
Yes, yes. No, cephalopods, because they had a
that's
head.
the one. Yeah.
Cephalopods, yeah. And she is just curious, exploring, and she removes, in a way, it's symbolic, but she removes all the gear that she's wearing to actually feel with her hands and be as she is, yeah, as she is in front of that species, which having, which I think the barrier was put on by the species, not by us, that barrier. So once she removed that, the conversation began, and it wasn't in words. So that would be my, I like that. I like that journey that we just took.
Yeah, no, listen, thank you so much. And you've been on with me for nearly
Yeah,
2 hours now, and you have a very busy day,
thank
so
you.
we're going to let you go here. But yeah, how can people get in touch with you? How can they find your work? What are the best ways to do that?
Well, thank you so much. I will just put like a link tree with many links where you can explore the projects that are coming up. And there are some juicy ones coming up, so please watch out. And we're interested soon for people to actually engage and interact. So let's see what happens. And of course, the book is coming up, the courses, the talks, the podcasts, and I welcome the opportunities as well. So thank you so much, Andy. This is a great opportunity, and thank you for the questions, from the audience.